At the start of the 1990s, Doctor Who was offered a new lease of life. With the TV show's return always just over the horizon, a horizon which seemed to be getting more distant by the day, this lease of life looked increasingly like it would be the only way the story could continue. But these books were commercial products rather than publicly funded television episodes, and thus the numbers would count. Could Doctor Who survive the disastrous drop in viewers, the increasingly negative press coverage and complete apathy from the public, and cross into a new medium with any long-term success? Peter Darvill Evans and the team at Virgin Publishing knew they had a difficult job on their hands, and they went all out to make sure the book range started with a bang, hoping to ensure a returning readership that would allow them to continue publishing stories for as long as the show was off the air. Why then was the first book so shit? Welcome to episode 2 of The Library of St. John the Beheaded, a history of Doctor Who original prose. John Peel wanted to be the author to write the first book in the Virgin New Adventures. Not because he was eager to continue the story of the Seventh Doctor or Ace, or that he had any great ideas for how their characters would develop. In fact, on the subject, Peel simply said, "I never liked the Seventh Doctor on television." Great start then. He also felt that, with better stories, they would have run a lot longer. Now, the cancellation of Classic Who has been discussed in depth countless times over the years, and numerous reasons have been given. I'm not sure I've come across the quality of the stories very much in that though. Still, if a writer's going to suggest that Remembrance of the Daleks, Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Ghostlight, Curse of Fenric and Survival, some of the boldest, most experimental and emotionally engaging stories in the whole of the classic series, were so bad that they got the show cancelled, then he really needs to back that up with an incredible story himself. Does he manage it? Spoiler, no. Ultimately, he just wanted to be the first name associated with this new era of Doctor Who, and if that involved him writing for characters and a version of the show that he disliked, well, that was no hurdle really. Peel's first idea was an adventure around a collection of people being used as a computer. It's an intriguing idea, and something tells me that it's been done in at least one of the show's expanded universe stories, but I can't remember which one that is. Please let me know below if you can think of the one I'm trying to think of here. Peter Darvill Evans instead suggested ancient Mesopotamia as a starting point from which Timewyrm Genesys grew. Oh, that title, by the way, nobody has a clue why there's a Y in Genesys. The book was finished in timely fashion in January 1991, and the cover art was initially given to Lars Pearson, who was the illustrator responsible for many Target novelisations. However, despite being given a Timewyrm design by Andy Lambert, Pearson struggled to come up with an image without the usual visual references from a TV version, and eventually he had to back out. The final cover was designed by Andrew Skilleter, who was then the designer of the Doctor Who video covers. It's actually a fairly good cover. I'm not completely convinced by the ghostly Seventh Doctor hangover things, but otherwise it's maybe the best thing about the book. It opens with a foreword to the entire series, written by Peter Darvill Evans, the series editor, written in February 91, in which he states, "Our objectives in publishing this series of novels are to continue the time and space peregrinations of the Doctor and Ace from the point at which we last saw them on television, at the end of the story's survival, to continue the Doctor Who traditions of exciting science fiction stories laced with humour, drama and terror, and to continue the trend of recent seasons of television stories towards complex, challenging plots with serious themes." He also said, "And you, the reader, will ensure this strangely wonderful man will continue to inspire the imaginations of millions of people all over the globe with his twinkling eye and his unquenchable thirst for knowledge and truth whenever or wherever he pops his head out of the door of that battered old police box. Finally, my thanks go to all those who have welcomed me so warmly into the Doctor Who family. I have this strange feeling it's one I shall never leave. Sadly, the book is all downhill from there. Actually, no, that's not fair. The prologue is pretty good. Okay, so it reads like one of the commonly occurring prologues from Target novelisations that kind of offers a glimpse into what happened before the main story. Ishtar, the prisoner on the spaceship, tries to take over the minds of the vessel's crew in order to survive the attack it's facing. The craft eventually crash lands on Earth. It's not exactly too broad and deep for television, as the books boasted they would be, but it feels very Who. This could be Aldred in The Hand of Fear or The Malice in The Awakening. The writing's decent, it's not literary, but it's pacey and filled with intriguing imagery. One imagines there's a decent sci-fi action novel within John Peel somewhere, one that this chapter might feature in. Unfortunately, the author was saddled with ancient Mesopotamia, a doctor and companion team he disliked, and a desire to explore the new adult-oriented world Doctor Who was going to exist in, and all of that pollutes the rest of the book. The sex is a commonly highlighted issue, and yes, it's bad. Arguably, with the books yet to establish themselves as adult fiction, a more cautious approach might have been advisable at this point, but either way, there's nothing stopping Doctor Who taking on the topic. There's a hint of it in The Curse of Fenric, and it's well handled. Ace is growing up and realising who she's becoming. The sex in Genesys, however, is little more than a mix of misogyny and titillation. Sexual attitudes in ancient Mesopotamia was certainly very different to ours, and there's potential for this matter to be explored or even used as scene setting. Instead, the first we hear of it is the first chapter, with Ta Nin jealous of what she sees as a 13-year-old barely marryable slut being fondled by Gilgamesh. That is a quote. He then slips his hand down the front of her and tweaks, and goes on to spill wine onto her breasts so he can lap it up. As Ta Nin considers her a whore, the king grabs her firm buttocks. And this is just the first chapter. Elsewhere, the king of Kish's daughter takes sex tips from her maid. Keep your mouth shut and your legs... ... she's interrupted. Men are mentioned queuing up for sex. Gilgamesh's groping of a woman is described with a grim, smutty humour. Ace complains about Gilgamesh touching her up, and worst of all, the Doctor replies that Ace should be broadening her mind and should feel grateful that they weren't somewhere worse. Now, the idea of ethical differences over different cultures and time periods is one that pops up in Doctor Who from time to time. Far less than you'd expect for a series that's about travelling in time and space, but this is probably the worst it's ever handled. In 1964 we had the Aztecs, in which Barbara is appalled by human sacrifice, and the Doctor, unhappily, tells her that history cannot be changed. The story is framed as a tragedy, with the inevitable conclusion that our heroes cannot prevent countless pointless deaths, revealing that travelling in time is more than just a holiday. The moral ambiguity is strikingly bold for a TV show largely aimed at a young audience, broadcast in the much more conservative and culturally insensitive time of the early 60s. After 30 years of progress, the best John Peel can manage is the Doctor telling Ace she's being narrow-minded for not wanting to be sexually assaulted. I kind of get what he was trying to go for, but it comes across so badly that it somehow manages to feel far more dated than anything from the original series. And for one reason, the Doctor is the moral compass of Doctor Who, and he should show disgust at the behaviour of the era rather than at Ace, even if he still has to accept that it happens. When we share Ace's, and most likely Peel's, continued distaste at the culture's standards, part of that distaste should not be aimed at the Doctor himself. As it is, it fails miserably as commentary. The sex aspect was picked up on in the media. Apparently, Peel was slightly concerned about the amount he'd included, thinking it may have been toned down in the edit, which seems like a strange way to write a book, but okay. Darvel Evans was clearly fine with it, however. In his words, it was absurd to be producing children's books for the franchise's now adult fanbase. The News of the World ran a fairly typical article filled with faux outrage under the headline, "Sexterminate Him." The piece was illustrated by a fully nude Sylvester McCoy from his concurrent appearance in the play Having a Ball. The article is typical tabloid trash. It doesn't shine any particular light on what happens. There's certainly no legitimate criticism, the kind that's also been aimed at the likes of Torchwood, that in aiming for adult, the writer eventually ends up somewhere close to horny teenage boy. The main character's introduction is equally awful. Ace starts stark naked, not the last time she'd find herself in this position during the VNAs, but that's about as positively as she's portrayed. She's lost her memory, and as a result we're introduced to her as she learns about herself. This could be potentially quite interesting. What does she think? She doesn't look that great, and her clothes could do with a bit more class. Have I mentioned that John Peel didn't like the Seventh Doctor and Ace? She panics about not knowing who she is or where she is, and her response is to comb her hair. And then she explores the TARDIS over several incredibly dull pages that reveal absolutely nothing to anyone who's even vaguely familiar with the ship. And when we finally meet the Doctor, he's almost immediately joined by the Fourth Doctor. So much for the book's looking forward. We get a warning from midway through Season 15's The Invasion of Time, which is a nice slug of unnecessary continuity right in the middle of the clean slate setup that's supposed to be here. It's almost as if Peel doesn't really know what he's doing. Then we get another huge splurge of continuity, briefly describing Ace's past in a way that will make no sense to a new reader. The Doctor is stated to be a Time Lord about 5 times, and then the pair fall into a one-off status quo of immature bickering, which resembles no other portrayal of the Seventh Doctor and Ace. Oh yes, and we meet the Brig, Victoria, Jamie, and Katerina. It's all very, very tedious. Look, I get it. It's a way of introducing new readers to the characters, the TARDIS, and the fact that there's a long history here. It just doesn't really work. It makes the reader dislike both the Doctor and his companion, and I honestly question whether they really needed introducing anyway. The show ran for 26 years without much in the way of a soft reboot, and the Target books managed to successfully sum it all up in a paragraph or two at the start. Were they really expecting a horde of new readers who'd never seen the show, knew nothing about it at all? What makes it so disappointing is that Survival had ended on such a great note. A more mature, experienced Ace and the Doctor walk off arm in arm ready for a new adventure, and this doesn't remotely feel like it continues straight on. The memory loss does at least allow for continuity issues to be hand-waved away. Some people put the entire Big Finish 7 and Ace stories before this book as a result, although there are major inconsistencies with Ace's age there. There's also a small season of books written by Mike Tucker and Rob Perry, which could fit in here, and the mind wipe of Ace certainly does make sense of them continuity-wise. And then there's the biggest insult of all: the Seventh Doctor isn't even present for the book's climax. Instead, he reverts back to his third self because he'd be better at solving things like that. I mean, we get it, John, you prefer 70s Who. That's probably true of half the readers, but you're so eager to undermine your lead character, maybe you're not the right person to be writing the first book in a series about him. We'll get interesting looks at the Seventh Doctor's strengths and weaknesses as a character in later books. He'll even be pit against other incarnations of himself, both literally and metaphorically. Usually it's done brilliantly, and if not, it's always interesting. But this is nothing of the kind. It's just Peel wanting to write for the Third Doctor because he actually likes the character, and he wants to be writing an official story where he can write something that's John Pertwee saying things about the Brigadier, Jo, Liz, Sarah Jane, Benton, and reversing the polarity of the neutron flow. But that's pretty much the extent of his characterisation here. And the worst thing, not only does the plan not work, but this is the version of the Doctor who inadvertently helps create the Timewyrm. The Timewyrm, by the way, is named by the Chronivores, because of course she is. Can't be a bit more 70s continuity in our 90s forward-thinking Doctor Who. Elsewhere, Gilgamesh starts well as a character. He's wily, cunning, intelligent. He knows how to treat those who serve him and makes plans for the future. He notes his weaknesses at storytelling, and so makes a mental note to hire a court composer to write songs boasting of his life. It's a good start. And then there's Enkidu, a Neanderthal. Now at this point this was set 3 stories after Ghostlight, another story featuring a Neanderthal. And with that tale's emphasis on evolution, Nimrod's character is a wonderful inclusion, and he's an important part of the serial. He's there for a reason, he's brilliantly characterised, he's a very empathetic character. Here, Enkidu feels like a wasted opportunity, and frankly a nonsensical one. His being a Neanderthal isn't particularly relevant to the plot. Ace remembers the plot of Ghostlight and Nimrod's role in that tale, and that seems to be it for acknowledging how odd Enkidu's presence is. It's clearly an attempt at making some sense of Enkidu's portrayal as a less civilised, wild man character in the poems that tell the story of Gilgamesh, but ultimately it just makes things feel more confused rather than less. And in his very first scene, the character of Gilgamesh is completely derailed. He goes from a wise and wily king to an impatient buffoon when faced with Endiku's concerns. This becomes default mode for the rest of the book. A boorish, impulsive fool who's little more than a joke, one who routinely manages to irritate every one of the main characters on a regular basis and continues to make things worse for them. Imagine Karnos from Mind Warp, only without the hints of depth and likeability that character is given. Given the potential to explore a legendary character like Gilgamesh, believed to be a real king who became the basis of a demigod featured in Mesopotamian mythology, it feels like a massive wasted opportunity. In the words of Ace, Gordon Bennett is completely hopeless. That's John Peel she's talking about there. Oh, and there's a seemingly important subplot in the first half of the book about traitors trying to get Gilgamesh killed that's not only completely unresolved but adds nothing to the plot whatsoever. At the end I was left wondering, what the hell happened to those characters? When it's not trying its hardest to be edgy and adult, the book reads like the worst of the Target novelisations. Characters speak in exposition half the time. When a man plots treason against his king, it's unfortunate that he cannot choose his fellow conspirators as he'd like. Great example of the kind of dialogue we're faced with here. And we also get the Doctor spouting rubbish about, bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly and so on, the kind of pop culture non-science that he should be well above. Gilgamesh tries to take Ace, who he believes is a goddess, to bed, in the same conversation that he tells her no man should sleep with a goddess. The plot relies on contrivance and coincidence. A priestess is required, and she happens to be the one who's witnessed Ishtar's true nature. The same princess then happens to be the first to meet the Doctor. Mesopotamian characters are baffled at the way the Doctor and Ace talk when needs be, and yet they also use modern slang when Peel forgets that they are in fact ancient Mesopotamians. The later Virgin New Adventures use adult leanings of the series to tell original inventive stories that explore profound concepts. Genesys ultimately reads like a children's book decorated with naked women. The only place the book comes close to doing well is in the descriptions of its setting. Some of the buildings are described in much detail, rituals and practices are well explained, there's an overall feeling of enthusiasm for painting a picture of the era and location. Similarly, Peel's characters are well described, visually at least. It's as if he was the talented set and costume designer, but somehow ended up with the task of writing the play as well. When we hear a song about Utnapishtim, a myth from the era with strong parallels to the story of Noah's Ark, it's given possible origins in Ishtar's flight from her own world, and it's the kind of thing that could be really expanded on to make an interesting, in-depth story, although we don't really hear much more. We meet him, and he's just a generic alien who probably looks like a person. We also get a few somewhat bleak glimpses into Ace's past, which they do fit with what we know of her upbringing, and they feel genuine and sympathetic. Again, it's the kind of aspect that the book could really do with looking at more. But away from these moments, the biggest problem is laid bare. It's just incredibly dull. There are different metrics by which we can judge things, but for me, the most accurate is how much I can read in one go. And with Genesys, I find myself looking away, checking my phone, getting lost in unrelated thoughts, focusing on music, or just generally zoning out every couple of pages. It's a length of book I could comfortably get through in a few hours, and yet this time it took me more than a week to read. So rarely does it engage the reader, so little does it offer to grab the attention. It just exists to be the first Virgin New Adventure and provides nothing else beyond that. The V&As are all notable for their fairly sloppy approach to spelling, grammar and other elements that really should have been picked up by a proofreader, and although this is far from the worst, it starts things off not great and has and among the usual small mistakes, it also has a couple of especially annoying moments where less is used instead of fewer, and the other way around, which just lends the whole affair a rather amateurish feel. There's also a weird moment where Ace remembers Paradise Towers, a story that actually featured Mel as a companion. Look, if you're going to do continuity porn, you really have to get the actual basic details right. The book ends with the Doctor and Ace on the hunt for the newly created Timewyrm, a creature considered by Gallifrey to be a threat to all of creation. It really feels like, despite all of its problems, the book is at least setting up a worthwhile series. As I work through these books, I'm going to try and pick out a few favourite sentences or even paragraphs, be they beautiful, profound or amusing. I struggled here, to be honest, although I did find myself sniggering at, "Is Perivale the home of the gods?" The first 20,000 copies of Timewyrm Genesys sold out on pre-order, which was enough to consider the book a definite success. Reviews were mixed, but lent towards the positive, perhaps simply on the grounds that it was a new Doctor Who adventure out to enjoy. For all its mixture of dullness and tonal unpleasantness, the main story feels still like Doctor Who, and all the beats are there, so it did its job. An illustrated abridged chapter appeared in Doctor Who magazine as a preview, and the Virgin New Adventures were well and truly on their way. Although elements of the book would appear later in the V&As, for the most part Genesys is a dead end. On its own, it hasn't added much lore to the Doctor Who universe, although a line in The Day of the Doctor, in which he references spending a week in ancient Mesopotamia, feels like a sneaky reference. Otherwise, Genesys is really remembered for two things: starting the run of Doctor Who original prose fiction, which is just about limped through to today. The 15th Doctor era seems to be finally getting a push in this direction again after a very quiet few years. And of course, being pretty awful. There are worse new adventures, but not many, and thankfully it's mostly on the up from here on. Next time on The Library of St John the Beheaded, a major improvement with the arrival of Uncle Terry with Timewyrm Exodus. Until then, please let me know what you thought of this book, and click all the usual buttons below to stay informed about my new videos and help my video get seen by more people. And I'll see you next time.